So it is 4 o'clock, and this is the Great War Discussion Group. Today we are hearing from Jerry Phillips, who is going to talk about animals in the Great War. Modern warfare perhaps was started in the Great War and continued the rest of the century and into this one, but the extent to which it was dependent on animals is simply unfamiliar to us today, as I think the introductory slide illustrates. Jerry, go ahead.
Thank you, Charlie, and welcome to everyone. I appreciate you coming out. This is probably the best weather day we've had in 4 months, so if you're with us today, I do appreciate it. The topic will be animals in the Great War. The subtitle, They Had No Choice, comes from the monument or the memorial to animals in war in Hyde Park, London. And I'll show you a picture of that near the end of the presentation. But I did like this photograph because it does express a very significant aspect of World War I, that it was constantly a collision of the old and the new. You have a tank here being the new, and you have this carrier pigeon conveying a message, which they had been doing for millennia. Here's what you can expect today. I'm going to focus on animals. To the extent I mention humans, it will be only for context. I will use photographs, a number of photographs to tell the story. I have 60 slides. I intend to be fairly fast moving with some of them. Some of them I'll spend some time on. But I hope to wrap this up in about 70 minutes. I do have a number of references. I will provide them upon request. There's no 1 or 2 or 3 comprehensive books you can find on the subject. There are a number of books on particular topics, like they'll focus on horses or dogs or pigeons. If you're interested in researching this, I would say start with the 2 museums, the National World War I Museum and Memorial, as well as the Imperial War Museum. They have very good resources on this topic. I want to send a shout out to Bart and his friends in the Western Front Association, particularly Lucy Betteridge Dyson, who provided me with a list of references that got me started and was very helpful. Here's what I'm going to try to discuss and some questions I'm going to try to answer. I'm going to talk about what animals served in the war, and that term served is the one used by the Imperial War Museum to describe the conduct of animals in the war. I'm going to describe where did they serve, what did they do, how many served and died, and you will find that those numbers are very difficult to understand and get a good grasp on. How were they cared for? We're particularly talking about the large animals then. We will also cover the animals that were a constant nuisance and indeed a threat, life-threatening animals to the soldiers in the trenches. And at the end, we'll talk about how animals are remembered today. And in that topic, we'll cover some of the famous animals as well. Where did they serve? Everywhere. They were essential to the conduct of the war. They were employed by all nations. They appeared in all theaters of the war. They were used in all areas of operations, and they formed the part of the daily life of combatants. If you just take a quick purview of our own museum and go through the East and West galleries, there is approximately 50 to 60 different photographs and other images of animals there. They're quite common to find. Now, what animals served? I've broken them down into 2 categories. I have the workers on the left. I have pets and mascots on the right. These lists are not exhaustive, but they're illustrative. You will find about any type of animal possible was made into a pet or mascot. I'm going to focus on the worker animals that were most significant to the war: the horses, the mules, donkeys, dogs, and homing pigeons. I'll mention oxen, camels, elephants, and slugs in passing. So what did they do? Well, they were key to transportation. The horse in particular was an exceedingly important animal for transportation. They served the cavalry, the scouts, as the photograph here. They were used as couriers. They were used in police duty. They patrolled prisoner of war camps, and they were personal mounts. If you were an officer, you generally had a horse assigned to you or had access to one. Supply, they were critical to the supplying of the soldier to the battlefront. They, in fact, were the engines that supplied the troops on the battlefield. And we're mainly talking about horses, mules, and to some extent, oxen. But this was an enormous task. A typical British division of 12,000 men would require 1,000 tons of supplies daily. That is equivalent to about 2 supply trains of 50 wagons each. That is according to the Imperial War Museum. And here you see a photograph of one of those supply trains that stretches a good distance off into the horizon. They were used in communications. Principally dogs and pigeons were couriers that were quite reliable and successful and were able to navigate through the trenches well. This dog, you may have noticed, is kind of wet. It just came across that canal up there. They were used medical evacuation. Horses and mules pulled ambulances. And then we had this quite a unique tinted stretcher device that was placed on camels and was used to carry wounded soldiers away from the battlefront into aid stations. They were used in construction and war production. This Asiatic elephant was taken from a traveling menagerie or circus and was impressed in duty to do some war production. And you'll also find elephants with heavy lifting construction tasks in Germany and elsewhere. They served on the home front, and this one elephant could do the work of 4 or more horses. Gas detection. And you're all familiar with the canary in the cage in the tunnel to protect the tunnelers from methane gases and other toxic gases. And we have an example of that of this Australian tunneling engineer here. But you may not have known about the slugs. Slugs actually were used by the United States Army to detect early detection of toxic and poisonous gases. A slug is not an insect. It is a mollusk. One of its relatives is the octopus, believe it or not. It had the ability, it has sensitivity to toxic gases 4 times that of a human, and it would shrink up its body when it came into contact with a toxic gas, and that would alert the soldier that a gas attack was imminent. And of course, they served as mascots, pets, and companions in all armies, in all theaters, in all places. And here we have the Hungarian soldier with his kitty. So the question is, how many served? This question vexed me for several months until finally I ran across this quote from the World War I Centennial.org website. And it said, every source of information on the use of animals in World War I has a discussion of the numbers involved, and every discussion comes up with different totals. I can attest that that is correct. It is hard to know. But let's give you some estimates. As to the worker animals, I'm not really going to focus too much on pets and mascots here. I don't think they're good numbers on that. The Imperial War Museum tells us 16 million animals served throughout the war. They do not tell us, as far as I can determine, where that number comes from. There are many different estimates on the equines, the horses, mules, and donkeys. The best I can tell you is they were in the millions. I have seen multiple different estimates for pigeons. The best I can tell you is over 100,000 pigeons served in multiple armies. Similarly with dogs, 20 to 50,000 dogs likely served in multiple armies. And the British do seem to have a pretty good handle on how many camels they used, and they estimate that at about 120,000. We have a better understanding of horses and mules from the perspective of the British and American forces. These numbers are probably some of the more reliable ones I was able to come across, and I've cited the source here for you. The U.S. provided about 1.3 million equines, that's horses and mules, to the various armies in Europe. And you can see here the number of equines that the American Army used during the war. The British estimate they used about 2.5 million. I've seen other numbers, but that seems to be a reasonable number. We have a good understanding of what Australia sent over. They sent over about 136,000 horses overseas. Oddly enough, most of those went to India. 30,000 of their whaler horses went to the Middle East, and we'll discuss those a little later. And Canada sent over about 120,000 horses. These are some of the better numbers I was comfortable with. So how many died? This is an even more difficult number to come to. It is commonly reported in a number of internet sources and even in some museums that 8 million horses died in the war. Some of the sources say 8 million equines, which would include horses, mules, and donkeys. None of the sources tell you where that number comes from. I don't know, but you will see it. Other estimates are that perhaps 3 to 6 million equines died in World War I. That, just to my sense, that's probably a more accurate number, but I don't know. We don't have a precise number on dogs, pigeons, camels. We just know they were in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. You do get a little better understanding of precision of numbers when you talk about individual stories and particular events. In one instance, in the Battle of Verdun, 7,000 horses were killed one day by artillery fire. That is not unreasonable considering the massed artillery that was used there. Another instance of a particular story is of this commandant, this Belgian commandant. He was the pigeon master of his loft here. And he had to burn that loft of over 2,500 of what was considered the finest pigeons in the world to keep them from the Germans. That would have been a very difficult task for him. And believe it or not, the national sport of Belgium is pigeon racing. And they had they believed, and probably did, had some of the finest pigeons, best trained pigeons at the time of the war. These estimates do not include wildlife. There are reports on the environmental impact of the war, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion today. Horse losses. We have a little better understanding of the horse losses with respect to the American and British forces and perhaps to the German forces. The British are pretty certain, I've seen these numbers, they lost approximately 484,000 horses killed in the war. That was about one horse for every 2 men killed. The Americans lost slightly over 64,000. I have seen estimates on the Germans ranging from 900,000 to 2 million. I have not seen estimates for the Russians or the Austro-Hungarian horses. I've seen very broad estimates for the French, something on the order of 1 million. The thing to remember is these horses died primarily from disease, starvation, and exhaustion rather than battle wounds. The U.S. Veterinary Corps generally had the view that if they could not remedy the horse's problem, fix its injuries, or cure its sickness within 30 days, they would probably put the animal down. And unfortunately for the horses, even after the war, they suffered immensely. Many of them were butchered for food after the war because we had starving populations. And those that weren't were left where they were and placed into labor. And there are reports of they were not treated well. So the poor horse suffered enormously in the war. They probably contributed the greatest and suffered the most. Here are the animals I'm going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on: the horses, mules, donkeys. I'll touch upon oxen and camels, and then I'll talk some about dogs and pigeons. The horse was absolutely indispensable. It was not only used for transportation, it was used to carry and haul enormous amounts of material to the front. You can break the horses down into generally 4 categories. You have the heavy draft horse, the light draft horse, the saddle, and the pack horses. The animals you see to the right pulling this gun carriage would be light draft horses. And you can see there that they could gallop in harness, and these horses are moving at a good clip here. You can see by the carriage bouncing up into the air. I've also given you the U.S. prices for these horses. They were not inexpensive. And you can see below the cost of horses, including transportation and fodder, to the U.S. alone of 85 million. And we have to remember the U.S. was in the war for a relatively short time compared to the British and the French and the Germans and some of the other combatants. This photograph is interesting. I would ask you to go watch the movie They Shall Not Grow Old, because I believe you can see this exact scene in a 1 or 2 or 3 second clip at 57 minutes of that movie. And you will find that this gun carriage is up in the air because they went over a little hump in the road. I just ran across that. I thought it was interesting, and I ask you to go check out the movie and see if you agree. I did want to give you a look at what a heavy draft horse would look like. We're generally familiar with riding horses, but heavy draft horses are not seen much today. This is a modern picture of a very healthy, probably a pedigreed breed called the Ardennais or the Ardenner. You can see the massive size of this animal. And this was the Germans' preferred gun horse. It was also used by the French, the Belgians. This horse had been a war horse for centuries. It was used in the Crusades. I did want to give you a look at the size of it, but I also wanted to just tell you a little bit about, it's important that when you're using a horse like this under the difficult situation, difficult circumstances of war, that the animal have an appropriate personality. And this one did. It was known for having a good temper, it had good endurance, and it could survive on short rations at times. So it made it a lot easier for the handlers to deal with an animal like this. Pack animals, the pack horses and mules. I wanted to show you this scene because it captured the Western Front at various times quite accurately. And there's no other way you're going to carry 200 or 300 pounds of supplies to the soldiers in this kind of environment without the pack animal. And these were animals that could carry up to 200 or 300 pounds. They required soldiers that were trained as packers. And it was important you pack the animal correctly, evenly. There are a number of reports of animals slipping into craters where they're filled with water, falling into mud and not being able to get out. Once that happened, the animal would probably be put down because they did not have the ability or the time to recover the animal. They would if they could, but often couldn't. And let's move on here. Here's a saddle horse, considered one of the more famous horses of the war. This is the Whaler. It's a mixed breed that came from New South Wales, Australia. And this gentleman here, R.M.P. Preston, who wrote a book about the cavalry in the desert during World War I, he said it was the finest cavalry mount in the world, in his view. The Australians sent over 120,000 of them. 90,000 of them went to India. 30,000 of them went to Middle East. They served in campaigns in the Sinai and Gallipoli, a horse of great endurance. It was able to survive the desert environment pretty well. It could survive on limited food and water for at least 2, 3, 4 days. And interestingly, cavalry use in the Middle East was more effective than it was generally on the Western Front. The wide open areas, the lack of trenches made the use of cavalry just more effective in that environment. And now I have a special feature for you. This doesn't relate to World War I, but it does relate to your museum experience, at least hypothetically, because there's been much talk about this animal. It's the guide horse. I did want to show you this animal because the volunteers are frequently asking, are we ever going to see a guide horse? My answer to you is it's highly unlikely you will not. This is a recent development. The only training school in the United States that I could find was opened in 1999, I believe in Tennessee or Kentucky. And as far as I know, it's no longer active. So get a good look. This is going to be it. Let's talk about the Army mule. The mule is a very fascinating creature. It was used extensively in the war, very effectively. The British at first were a little hesitant to use the animal, but became very attached to it after using it in the field. Charles Darwin had a great quote here. He says it's a hybrid. Its father is typically a donkey known as a jack and a horse known as the female horse known as the mare or the dam. It can go the other way, but generally it's the donkey, it's the male, the horse, the female. But what you get is a better worker than either parent. And Charles Darwin says a hybrid should possess, he says it's just amazing that a hybrid should possess more reason, memory, obstinacy, social affection, powers of muscular endurance, and length of life than either of its parents. Seems to indicate that art has here outdone nature. And that is generally the view of what I've read. This animal was a better worker, more reliable, needed less grain than horses, was able to carry heavy loads over long distances, was generally sensitive and intelligent, agile. If you want to go down to the Grand Canyon, you're going to ride on a horse or a mule train, not a horse train. And there was even instances where they were smart enough to figure out when they were in trouble and get out of it. There is always the story that the mule is stubborn and the mule is difficult. What I read is the mule doesn't suffer fools gladly. If the mule senses the handler knows their business and treats them well, the mule will be very good and will do an enormous amount of work, and did in World War I. It was, by all accounts, anyone that handled mules was very happy with it. And now, you may not know this, Lathrop, Missouri, about 40 miles north of Kansas City, was the mule capital of the world in 1917, 1918. If you go up there today, I think they even like to tell you they're the mule capital of the world. This was because two gentlemen here, John Guyton and William Roscoe Harrington, two gentlemen from Alabama, came north and became mule traders. They developed a huge mule trading business. They had facilities in Lathrop, Missouri, Kansas City, St. Louis, Nashville. They had a port from which they shipped at Port Chaumette in Louisiana. And they shipped out a lot of mules during the war. The Lathrop facility was a 4,700 acre mule farm, employed over 300 people, had 15 mule barns. Here's one of them. You see number 15 right here. These are large structures. I've seen different reports, but at the peak, they could have between 10 and 40,000 mules on site. They provided over 300,000 mules and horses to the British Army. The average cost for a mule is about $150. Quite an operation, and I believe they contended that they had mule agents in all 48 states from which they could pull stock. And you may not know that the British were here. The British Remount Commission had agents that took up residence in Lathrop, Missouri. The Remount Commission was charged with buying and training equines for the British Army. The agents are here in Lathrop to make sure that the animals they want are the animals they're getting. So they are making sure the animals are healthy, of the appropriate age, appropriate size. And because there are allegations from time to time that mule traders can be less than honest. But I've never heard that about Guyton and Harrington. But the British were here to make sure they got what they paid for. Let's talk about donkeys. They're an interesting creature. They're primarily adapted to arid lands. They're known to be intelligent but cautious. One commentator said the donkey has a very keen appreciation for survival. And they were used in Italy, the Middle East, and mountainous areas, primarily for supply transport. They were brought to Gallipoli to carry water. and there they met up with John Simpson. His real name is John Simpson Kilpatrick. He dropped the Kilpatrick because he had had a checkered background and didn't want the Army to know who he was. So he dropped the Kilpatrick, became John Simpson. He got into the Australian Medical Corps. He was a stretcher bearer. He is the first to use donkeys, they believe, to carry wounded soldiers from the battlefield to the aid stations. He was in Gallipoli 3 weeks before he was killed. Within that period of time, he's credited with transporting over 200 soldiers to safety by the use of the donkey. And the donkeys were quite useful in the mountainous areas. Oxen. Oxen were used, but generally only where they were found. They were used occasionally or on a limited basis. They're very strong, but they're slow, they eat a lot, and they have poor agility. So the horses and the mules were just a much better draft animal than was the oxen. Camels. Camels were used quite extensively in the desert. They were used in the Middle East and the African desert. Used by a number of forces, British, Turkish, Arab, perhaps the Germans used them as well. The British formed the Imperial Camel Corps, made up of British and Australian soldiers. You can see the numbers there. They were involved in military campaigns in Suez, Sinai, and the Palestine area, and during the Arab Revolt. A camel is an interesting creature. They're very strong in the desert. They have good endurance. They can go without water for a good period of time. They're, however, a bit sensitive and finicky. They're subject to get head colds. If their feet get too wet, they can have difficulties. And they can kick, bite, and spit. So I wouldn't want to be a soldier in the Camel Corps, but they did the job. And they suffered enormously. The best estimate is over 130 to 140,000 camels died in service. Now, the question is, how were they cared for? These large animals, horses, mules, they require a lot of attention. They require a lot of food. The United States Army believed that the mule needed 23 pounds of fodder daily. A heavy draft horse needed at least 30 pounds. A horse can drink 8 gallons of water daily. A horse can drink 5 gallons at a sitting. They require attention. They require veterinarian care. They require trainers to get them used to being used in a team and used in a battlefield, a battle environment. They require packers, groomers. Horses get muscle aches. They need to be rubbed down. They require teamsters, people that can handle a team of mules and horses, and farriers, people that can take care of their feet. And these horses and mules are always on their feet, and they get problems. And they require the protections from hazards of war. So you needed a lot of manpower to take care of these animals. But it didn't always turn out that way. The reality of war was simple. There was no pasture land left. It was chewed up in France. I've read different accounts that 6 to 7 million acres of agricultural land in France was destroyed. There were always a supply and food shortages for these animals. These animals, many of them died by starvation in the thousands, if not tens of thousands. They were seen at times gnawing on wooden wagon wheels, trying to find some nourishment. They were worked to death. They suffered from exhaustion from work, the weather. They would develop sore muscles, just any sort of any number of ailments that you have when you do heavy work. And the stress of combat would take its toll on them. Battlefield units tended to work the animals until work them to death because they knew they couldn't get replacements easily. So if you had a sick or injured animal, if you could get them to a place where they could get treatment and rehabbed, they would be a better animal, but they didn't have that luxury. Interestingly, the long sea voyage, when you're transporting, like the U.S. did, they sent over 1.3 million equines. They all have to come over by ship. That voyage was often very disturbing to the animal. They're stuck in stalls. They can't get exercise. They are in an environment where diseases can be spread easily. And there are reports that, I saw one report that an equine, once it got off the boat, might take 3 to 7 days to get back to normal. And some of them never did. Some of them never were able to recover from the voyage, and many times they would be put down. And that's the magic word they use for euthanasia or being shot, being put down. This photo intrigues me. I wonder if it was staged. I don't know. But we have these two scrawny horses pulling this large train car with all these soldiers on it. And I can't imagine they made good time. It seems like to me they could probably walk faster than these two poor horses could pull it. But I don't know. But I was just intrigued by that photo. The veterinarian corps. All the armies had some form of veterinary corps. I'm going to offer my opinion. I think the British probably had the best. The Italians apparently had a good one. The Americans had a poorly formed one at first, which got a little better. I don't think the Germans, they may have had some good veterinarians. I don't think they had the resources for a good corps. But what a veterinarian corps is going to do is it's obviously going to treat wounds and injuries, but it's also going to try to prevent illness, which is a real problem amongst these animals. And their principal job was to get the animals in good health as they could and get them back in the line. So they want to return the animal to service, and that is their job. These diseases were quite prevalent. Mange was very prevalent. It's a parasitic problem that affects the skin that really annoys the animal and really degrades their ability to work. Equine flu was a problem. If it got in the herd, they generally would cut out the affected animal, put them down, and get the other animals away. Glanders is a bacterial infection that is very harmful to the animal. They have to immediately get the animal out of the herd and kill it. And then they would deep bury it and try to sanitize the facilities as much as they could. And as I understand it, glanders still is very difficult to treat. The U.S. Veterinarian Corps was established right after the U.S. got into the war. At the beginning, it was quite unprepared, disorganized, had no plans for hospitals. It did grow during the war from a mere 72 officers at the beginning to over 18,000 officers and men. And they did set up 3 veterinarian schools in the United States. But there was always a dearth of veterinarians both in the United States and in Europe for the United States Army. The British Army Veterinarian Corps, as I mentioned, I think it was probably the best, if not one of the better ones. And they had learned lessons from the Boer War of 1899, 1902. They had had a horrible wastage of animals in the Boer War and come under considerable criticism, so they made some major reforms. So by 1914, they had a decent-sized veterinary corps compared to the size of their army of about 1,300 men, and that grew to 43,000 men by the end of the war. By the end of the war, half of all British veterinarian surgeons were in the army. And they believe they treated about 2.5 million horses, and 2 million were returned to duty. And they as well as the French Veterinary Corps would treat U.S. Horses and mules, because our Veterinary Corps, at least at the beginning, was just inadequate. And I like this photograph. I appreciated the fact that this horse gets to ride in a truck to the treatment facility. It's only fair. Humane organizations. These civilian humane organizations played an important role in caring for the animals, the horses and mules. In Britain, it was the Blue Cross Fund. In the United States, it was the Red Star Animal Relief, the Humane Society. They provided extensive supplies and expertise for front lines in France. The Blue Cross Fund built and operated an entire veterinarian hospital in France. And the statistics are they treated over 650,000 horses by 1917. And just a note of on the language, the Blue Cross Fund refers to our Dumb Friends League. Dumb does not refer to intelligence, it refers to the fact the animals can't speak. So they had no advocates other than these folks who put in a lot of effort trying to take care of the animals. Let's move on to the canines, the dogs. I like this particular quote from this London wife, mother, and dog owner. She said, "I have given my husband and my sons, and now that he too is required, I give my dog." And the British during the war at various times did make demands upon the civilian population to turn over their dogs, turn over their farm animals, their horses, if they could, without causing them to starve on the farm, because there was a great need for these animals. And I also have here the Red Baron with his, what he calls his little lap dog. You can see his little lap dog there. I'd hate to see a big lap dog if that's a little one. But canines were used. Multiple breeds of canines were used for many different purposes. Of course, they were guard dogs. They were used as messengers, as we've seen. They were used as medical assistants. We'll talk a little more about that. Here, they're used as draft animals. The dogs had a keen sense of hearing and could determine when artillery was coming in and alert the soldiers. Sergeant Stubby, one of the famous dogs we'll talk about, he was famous for barking when he could hear artillery coming in and getting the soldiers into safety. Dogs were used as ratters. Rats were a serious problem in the trenches, and of course they were pets and mascots where they would be found. Here are the Red Cross Mercy dogs. These dogs were very specialized trained animals. They were trained either by the Army or Red Cross societies. They were trained to go into war-torn areas, into no man's land, and find wounded. And then they had a variety of ways they might alert medics to their location. They would generally carry a saddlebag or the kit here, have some water, generally have a little whiskey or brandy, and some first aid supplies like bandages and so forth. There were also instances of the dog staying with a very severely injured soldier and stay with him until he passed on. And I just like Mark Twain's somewhat sarcastic comment here that heaven goes by favor. If it went by merit, you would stay out and your dog would go in. I think that applies to the Red Cross Mercy dogs. And they were used extensively, essentially by all armies. Here's one of the humans we're going to mention, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin H. Richardson. He was considered the British foremost authority on dog training at the time of the war, and generally during his lifetime, as far as I could tell. He headed the British Dog Training School during World War I. It was in southern Scotland, I believe. His techniques were quite revolutionary. They're used today. He developed reward-based training in order to reinforce good behavior. He would fire any worker who was cruel to an animal. And he believed the Airedales, which we have here, were the best dog for messenger service. And I picked this picture. This is actually in 1940. He lived to, I think he died in 46 or 48. But I picked this so you could see him with his Airedales. He was quite partial to them, but he trained other dogs as well. And now we're going to come to the carrier or homing pigeon. And we have our own Dr. Christopher Warren here telling us that pigeons were one of the most reliable forms of communication in the war, and indeed they were. And pigeons had been used as war pigeons or postal pigeons for millennia, dating back many centuries. This is an interesting photograph. The Germans tried to make this pigeon into a photo recon pigeon by placing this small camera on it. There is a fault to this experiment, and we'll discuss that in a minute, but it's an interesting idea. and a remarkable photograph. The fault in that theory is the pigeon only goes one way. The pigeon will go from the field to the loft. So unless you want to photo recon your own lines, the photo recon pigeon probably wouldn't work very well. But you can see here a mobile loft, and this is where the pigeons would be trained to return to. I cannot see it on this photograph, but somewhere there is a door that swings inward. And when the pigeon would return with a message, it would go through that door and sound a bell. And that's when the pigeon handler would know the pigeon had arrived with a message, and then they knew to take action to retrieve the message and get it to wherever it needed to go. The pigeon, the homing pigeon or carrier pigeon, is a descendant of the rock dove, which to me, I've seen them, they look just like a pigeon. But they're a descendant of this bird. The ones that are very good at what they do are selectively bred to take advantage of their innate homing ability. The very top of the line racing pigeons can go 100 miles an hour. Your average pigeon doesn't. The top of the line racing pigeon can go 1,000 miles distance. Your average pigeon doesn't. As best I could determine, a typical trip in World War I is maybe 20, 50 miles, maybe not. But they had a remarkable success rate. And this is what Dr. Warren was talking about, 95% success rate. I've seen that number repeatedly. Really a remarkable achievement. And then you would have the pigeon handlers. These are soldiers that are trained in handling the pigeon. You would have a chief pigeoneer or pigeon master. The French had pigeon masters. These were often people who in civilian life had experience with pigeons, and their job is to acclimate the pigeons to their lofts, to get them used to returning to those lofts. And remember, these are birds and they reproduce fairly quickly. So the pigeon master is going to have to raise some young pigeons and get them acclimated to the loft as well. So it's a process. Then you would have field personnel. These are soldiers selected from the ranks. They would be trained on basic pigeon care. It's important that the pigeon kept healthy, fed regularly, clean, and not be treated too roughly, because these are delicate birds, and these pigeon handlers would be trained in message writing to make sure they had very short, succinct, and accurate messages. Here to the right is an exhibit, an artifact from the National World War I Museum and Memorial. This is the pigeon handler's pad, pencil, and the little capsules the messages would be placed in, and you can see the little ring attachments where it would be placed over the pigeon's foot. And that's what the pigeon is going to carry with the message. You may ask the question, how do pigeons navigate? The answer is no one really knows. There's much research that's still ongoing. I give here some of the basic, some of the hypotheses they have. Some think pigeons navigate by visual clues or landmarks. Some think they use the Earth's magnetic field. They're even now exploring the idea that there are cells in the retina that can align with the Earth's magnetic field. Similarly, a bacteria in their ears can align with the magnetic field. And some think they key on certain sounds or odors. And some think different pigeons use different techniques, and some think pigeons use several of these techniques. It's not well understood, but they work. 95% of the time, they get where they're going. I did want to mention some of the hero pigeons. There's Cherami here, who is on display in the National Museum of American History. You probably are all familiar with this black Czech male carrier pigeon. It was hatched in the spring of 1918. It was given to the U.S. Army by the British Home Forces Pigeon Service. It, in fact, carried about 12 messages during the Meuse-Argonne campaign. Its last message was for October 1918. And that's the famous message where the lost battalion, as you all know, were 5 companies of men. They were cut off from their support units. The Germans had them surrounded, pounded them very hard for 4 or 5 days. Finally, the Americans decided they would help them by bringing in artillery support because they didn't know the precise location of their own men. They started bringing friendly fire down upon them. So this pigeon carried the message back to headquarters, asking that the artillery stop and giving a more precise position of the lost battalion. Cherami traveled 25 miles in 25 minutes. During that time, it was wounded in the breast, lost an eye, and lost a leg. It survived the war, died in 1919. The soldiers that survived Lost Battalion believe that the pigeon truly saved their lives. That's just one example. There were other pigeons. Spike here was an American pigeon that carried a life-saving message. The Valiant was a French pigeon that carried a life-saving message during the Battle of Verdun. And number 498 was a British pigeon that carried a life-saving message from some downed flyers. And believe it or not, airplanes would carry pigeons for purposes of communication. If they were an observation plane, that's how they're going to get information back to the headquarters. Just like you saw in the tank at the beginning, the tanks had pigeons too to carry messages. The Valiant and number 498, upon arriving and delivering their message, they died. So they gave their last full measure to delivering those messages. Well, we've talked about the good. Now we're going to talk about the bad and the ugly, the harmful animals that were in the war, because there were several and they proliferated in the millions. Here's a quote from Robert Graves' memoir, where he talks about a young officer coming into the line. He was given a bed, and he woke up in the middle of the night because of a disturbance, and he put his flashlight on the bed, and he found 2 rats on his blanket tussling for the possession of a severed hand. Actually, not an unusual story. The rats were a constant problem, constant torment to the soldiers in the trench. They ate their food, chewed their clothes, rummaged in their packs. They kept them up at night. They proliferated in the millions. There are a number of soldiers saying they grew to the size of cats. They would feed on the severely injured and the dead. Worst of all, they spread disease. And the soldiers would hire these rat hunters to come in and eliminate the rats. And here you see this rat hunter with his dog, his little terrier dog. And you can see his day's work of rats that he has collected. The rats carried lice. And a body louse is a very unpleasant insect. It is a parasite. It's a blood-sucking parasite. It carries a bacteria that causes typhus. And typhus was a very bad disease at that time. It could cause a number of symptoms, certainly disable the soldier, if not ultimately lead to the soldier's death. But certainly would make soldiers not combat ready. There's one insect expert out of one of the Montana universities that believes that typhus killed an estimated 2 to 3 million soldiers and civilians on the Eastern Front in World War I from typhus carried by lice. A baby louse is a nit. And when the soldiers went about getting these lice out of their clothing, because they would get stuck in their hems and in the thick wool of their pants and so forth, they would go nitpicking. You may have heard that term some. And they would use a fine-tooth comb to try to pull the nits and the lice out of their clothing. So some interesting language terms that the lice have given us. But they were a very unpleasant little critter that was a constant torment to the soldiers. Flies and mosquitoes, particularly the flies in the desert and humid areas, were horrible. they would develop in huge swarms because of the terrible sanitation and the dead bodies, and they would cover and contaminate the soldiers' food. So they were a constant worry. Even here we'll talk about the polar bears, the Americans that went into Russia late in the war. They went into swampy areas of North Russia and just were covered with mosquitoes and said they were awful. And then and now, the mosquito is the most dangerous animal in the world. It kills about 750,000 humans annually from malaria primarily, and it's still a scourge of the world. Africa is a place you would not want to be in World War I. Here we have a quote from Colonel Josiah Wedgwood IV, and that is the direct descendant of the original Josiah Wedgwood of pottery fame. He likened fighting in Africa to like fighting in a zoo. And he did command a South African machine gun company for a period of time in southern Africa. Case in point is the Battle of Tonga, which is on the southeast coast of Africa, just north of Zanzibar there, right along the coast. The British at that time were trying to throw the Germans out of what was then German East Africa. And they engaged in a firefight along the beach, and the trees contained hives of bees. And it set off swarms of angry bees that attacked both sides. There's one report that one British soldier was reportedly stung 300 times in the head. Very unpleasant situation. The result of that battle was the British were totally unsuccessful in getting the Germans out at that time, and the battle was discontinued after a couple of days. African animals and their associated disease killed more soldiers and horses than fighting did, by far, 30-to-1 ratio. Horses suffered enormously in Africa. I've seen numbers of 80% died from things like equine sleeping sickness and other ailments. These are horses from North America or Europe, and they have no immunity whatsoever to the diseases that occur in Africa. And I ran across this one little tidbit that in 18 months, 30 British soldiers were killed by lions and rhinos. You just didn't want to be fighting in Africa. Let's move on to some of the famous animals in the war. These are ones you've probably all heard of. Here's whiskey and soda, the two lion cubs that the American Lafayette Escadrille acquired from Paris, in Paris. And they would entertain the flyers for a while at least at their camp. Eventually, the lions were returned to or given to the Paris Zoo after one of them ate the Major Lufberry's hat. But they were quite a spectacle for a while there with the flyers. You may have heard of Sergeant Billy, or perhaps not. He is famous in the Canadian Army. He was Sergeant Bill from Saskatchewan. He was a mascot of the 5th Infantry Battalion. He had the ability, according to accounts, to alert soldiers to incoming artillery. There are accounts that says he tried to butt soldiers into the trenches if he detected incoming artillery. Interestingly, he allegedly was court-martialed twice. Once for eating the company's roster list, and the second time for getting into a fight with another sergeant. It wasn't specified whether that other sergeant was animal or human, or goat or human. It doesn't say. But you can see Sergeant Billy today. He's stuffed and on display in the Broadview, Saskatchewan Historical Museum. You're probably all familiar with Winnipeg the bear, Winnie the bear. This is a black bear that Harry Colburn, a Canadian veterinarian, picked up in White River, Ontario for $20. And $20 is a lot of money back then. And White River, Ontario is halfway between Thunder Bay and Toronto. So you're up in the woods there. He took the bear with him to England. It became a mascot and pet for some British units there, or pardon me, Canadian units there. He named the bear Winnipeg because that's the Canadian city from which most of his soldiers in his unit came. Before he went to France, he couldn't take the bear with him, so he gave the bear to the London Zoo. There, the bear became quite the attraction of A. Milne and his son Christopher Robin, who would visit the bear on a regular basis. And it inspired Milne to write the children's book, Winnie the Pooh. So that's your story of Winnipeg the bear. You've probably seen the movie The War Horse, or perhaps read the book The War Horse. But to the British historians, this is the real war horse. This is Warrior, which was a very fine riding horse, well-bred horse, a thoroughbred gelding from the Isle of Wight, excuse me. And it was owned by Jack Seeley, who you see setting on the horse here. This horse served for 4 years on the Western Front, and it was involved in multiple battles. And it was rode early in the war by John French, who was the primary commanders of the British Army early in the war, and later rode by Jack Seeley. It was twice buried by shell fire, but never seriously injured. It survived the war, returned to the Isle of Wight, lived out a nice life, died Easter 1941. The Times of London printed a very lengthy obituary, and they coined the term horse the Germans could not kill. And he has his own website today. It's operated by the grandson, I believe, grandson or great-grandson of Jack Seeley. You may not know about Edith Cavell's dog, Jack. And here we have her dog, Jack. He is at the bottom on the right. Edith, as you know, was a British nurse who was living in Belgium when the war broke out. She immediately began helping Allied soldiers who were caught behind the lines escape from the Germans in Belgium. And purportedly, she and Jack would take walks and do other things to try to create a cover to allow the soldiers to slip away. As you know, Edith was caught by the Germans, they alleged she was a spy, and upon that basis, they had her executed in 1915. Jack survived the war. He died in 1923. And you can go online and see him embalmed. Go online at the Imperial War Museum. He was on display. I don't believe he is anymore. I think they took him off display in 2013. But an interesting story that I wasn't aware of until I did this research. And now we come to Sergeant Stubby, one of our more famous mascots and animals of World War I. He was a stray Boston Terrier that just showed up on the grounds of Yale University one day where the 102nd Infantry Regiment was training. And the soldiers took a liking to him, and they kept him around. And he ended up serving 18 months in France. He served in multiple battles, or appeared in battles. He was wounded 3 times. He was gassed. He allegedly caught a spy. It's pretty clear he grabbed onto the seat of the pants or the pant leg of a German. I don't know if the German was a spy or not, but he apparently did catch a German. He was the most decorated dog in World War I. He met 3 presidents. He is now stuffed in the Smithsonian Institution, and he has his own brick at the National World War I Museum and Memorial, and you can see it here. It's on the west. It's on the west side, about a third of the way up. I have the exact coordinates if you need it. But the interesting thing about Sergeant Stubby is that when they were getting ready to take him to France, the soldiers snuck him on. They put him in one of their overcoats and slipped him on the ship. The commanding officer eventually found out there was a dog aboard and was inclined to not let the dog proceed. But the soldiers had trained Stevie is a very smart animal, trained him to stand at attention and salute. So when he went in to meet the commander, he promptly stood at attention and saluted, and the commander thought that was suitable to allow him to continue on in his service with the army. So the rest is history. Rin Tin Tin, another famous dog from World War I. And this is apparently a photo of Rin Tin Tin as a puppy. And I'm speculating, but I do not know that the soldier handling him is Lee Duncan, who was the soldier that found him in a bombed kennel in 1918 and saved him. He also saved another dog, tried to bring that dog back, but it died on the voyage, return voyage to the United States. Lee was from LA, so he returned with his dog to LA, trained him, got him into the movies, originally into the silent films, but Rin Tin Tin appeared in 25 Warner Brothers films. He was under contract with them. He died in 1932. Latest information I have is his descendants continue today. There's Rin Tin Tin the 12th, who's making appearances, as late as about 8 years ago, 2017. So his prodigy lives on. Now I'm going to start wrapping this up by how do we remember these animals that served in the war? Well, there's many memorials in what I would say the Allied countries, the U.S., Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. The prominent one is the Animals in War Memorial at Hyde Park in London, United Kingdom. Here, this is the one I referenced at the beginning of our talk. It opened in 2004. It's dedicated to all the animals that served and died alongside British and Allied forces in wars and campaigns throughout time. And it notes they had no choice. All these animals were draftees. None of them volunteered. I'm only going to run through about 4 of the memorials. Here's the memorial or the plaque memorializing the Valiant, the hero pigeon of Verdun that we mentioned earlier. This is at Fort Vaux in Verdun, France. To the right is a memorial in London of the Imperial Camel Corps. We talked about the Camel Corps. Well, they have their own monument. To the left here, we have the memorial to the Whaler, the Australian saddle horse, and to the Australian Light Horse Cavalry that served in the Middle East in World War I. And this is in New South Wales, appropriately, the home of the whale. And finally, we have Poppy, the Warhorse Memorial, which is at Ascot, UK. Notice the wreath of purple flowers. Those are purple poppies. And the purple poppy is the flower that is the symbol for remembrance and commemoration of the animals that died in war. The red poppies for the humans, the purple poppy for the horses and the other animals that died. And I want to thank you. I want to end on this note because it's an extraordinary coincidence that today is War Animal Day, 24th of February. It's also known as Purple Poppy Day. And this is a day that is recognized in the UK and Australia, New Zealand, and I think now in Canada. But this is the day where we remember those animals that served and died in wars, and particularly in the Great War. And that's all I have. I want to say thank you. I think I brought this in under time, and I'll try to answer any questions if you have any. I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks again.
Jerry, this is David. Great job. Is the facility in Lathrop still operating?
No, Guyton and Harrington went out of business after the war. There was just no need for that level of mules. They were a wartime production. And John Guyton is actually buried with his wife in Kansas City. Harrington retired to Louisiana where he died and he's buried. But no. If you go on the Lathrop, Missouri city website, they'll talk to you a little bit about the Guyton and Harrington and the mule capital of the world. But as far as I know, if there's any mules up there, there are very few
Jerry, thank you very much. That was an outstanding presentation, and I don't know how we worked out the coincidence that today is War Animal Day, but I'm very happy that it worked out that way.
Charlie, it was all your timing. You need to take credit for it.
Better lucky than good. Bruce, you had a comment from the land of the animal lovers?
Well, yes. I read somewhere that a third of all the stuff that was transported across the English Channel during the Great War was fodder, which says something about the number of horses. I love the photo of Simpson and his donkey because, as you'll have gathered, from time to time, there's a love-hate relationship between this country and Australia. And the Australians, for some time, have been trying to persuade the British that Simpson, having saved so many men with his donkey, should have been awarded a posthumous VC. The British response to that is that, firstly, he stole the donkey, and secondly, he was an infantryman, not Australian Medical Corps. And for 3 weeks, he wasn't where he was supposed to be. And far from getting a VC, he could have been court-martialed for desertion. A couple of other little things. I don't know if you're aware of it, but before the First World War, in Britain, the body louse was nicknamed a chat. So when the guys, having done stand to and the front lines, and then breakfast and whatever tasks officers awarded them, they had time. They could take off shirts and so on, and try to either use thumbs or um, lighter or whatever to try and burn off lice. They were doing it together. What they were doing was chatting, which gives a rather different perspective on, that word. And finally, the memorials. I'm not a fan of modern art, but the memorial in the middle of a roundabout between Ypres and Popperinge in Belgium, named Agony, to horses, is peculiarly effective. And indeed, last Sunday, guiding a coach of 30 odd children, we went round the roundabout twice so that they could take a photo of that memorial to the horses. So there's quite a few memorials about.
Very good. Well, Jerry, thank you very much. That was really good.